The United States and China are arguably the two most powerful nations in the world. According to many, they will be the main axes of a new Cold War. However, the truth is that this relationship hasn't always been like this. There was a time when things were very different. During World War II, a common enemy caused these two countries to come together to defeat it and put an end to the campaign of terror and death that was taking place in Asian territory. Nevertheless, even as allies, the frictions that occurred between them were a harbinger of how their relationships would evolve. Today, in this new episode of Military History, we will tell you all about the moment when China and the United States allied to confront the Empire of Japan. While for most historians, World War II began in 1939 with the invasion of Poland by Nazi Germany, if you were to ask the Chinese population of that time, they would probably speak of another date. In 1937, Japanese troops launched a large-scale invasion of the territory of the Republic of China, beginning the Second Sino-Japanese War. The atrocities suffered by the victims would rival those that occurred on the European front, with some authors even referring to these crimes as the Asian Holocaust. The invasion of China gave rise to a theater of operations often forgotten by historians, although not any less important for the war. The China-Burma-India front not only rivaled the Eastern Front in terms of the number of soldiers, where the Soviet Union and Germany fought, but it also resulted in a surprising alliance between the United States and China. Nowadays, it is unlikely that such a relationship between these countries will be repeated. However, during those uncertain days, anything was possible. In the following testimony, you can hear an American veteran recalling his struggle on this front.
Overall mileage, the CBI theater was the largest theater of war in World War II because it covered China, Burma, and India, which is a lot of territory. Right now, you can pick up a book about World War II. It might have 100 pages in it. You do good to have one page in there about the CBI. A lot of people didn't know we had a war going over there. I've been asked by veterans, they should know better. They said, where'd you serve? I told them. Did they have a war over there? I said, well, if they didn't, they were damn sure shooting at us.
But before discussing this alliance, let's first go back to the turbulent historical relationship between the invader and the invaded. In the late 19th century, the First Sino-Japanese War occurred, where the Japanese Empire defeated China, which was then under the rule of the Qing dynasty. The severe humiliations inflicted by the victor during this war would linger in the memory of the Chinese people for years. China was forced, among other things, to cede Taiwan to the Japanese Empire and to recognize the complete autonomy of Korea, which was under its control at the time. At the end of the conflict, the regional dominance of East Asia passed into the hands of Japan. The humiliations suffered by the Asian giant led to a general discontent that, just a few decades later, brought an end to dynasties as a form of government. While China was experiencing internal rebellions, Japan rose as a power thanks to its modernization policies. Taking advantage of its neighbor's weakness, the Japanese Empire seized the opportunity to demand more and more commercial privileges, which China had no choice but to accept. This, coupled with the presence of Japanese garrisons within its territory, increasingly fueled anti-Japanese sentiment. In the 1920s, the political party gaining importance in China was the Kuomintang. Its armed branch, called the National Revolutionary Army, sought to unify the country under its power. To achieve this, they set out to defeat those who had been ruling the nation since the fall of the Qing dynasty, also aiming to expel the Japanese invaders. With this goal in mind, in 1928, the National Revolutionary Army confronted Japanese garrisons in the province of Shandong, stationed there to protect Japan's commercial interests. This significantly worsened the already complicated relations between these two countries. Later that same year, the Kuomintang achieved the reunification of China. Finally, in 1931, Japan launched its plans for the total invasion of its neighbor, starting with the important region of Manchuria. This began with the Mukden incident, where the Japanese detonated the railway tracks of the South Manchuria Railway Company, which were owned by the Japanese Empire in a false flag operation. Although the explosion was so small that trains could continue to run as if nothing had happened, Japan blamed the incident on Chinese dissidents and used this alleged attack as an excuse to invade the region. Just 6 months later, the empire established the puppet state of Manchukuo in this region. In the following years, there were some armed confrontations between the two countries, but China's military weakness always resulted in their defeat, leading to the continual cession of territory or economic and political power to the Japanese. On July 7, 1937, Japan launched a full-scale invasion against the Republic of China. Although this attack caused the nationalists and communists to unite in a single front to fight the invader, by January 1938, Japan managed to take over the main cities, ports, and railways, leaving its enemy virtually defeated. Japanese soldiers committed terrible atrocities against the Chinese civilian population, although none more brutal than the Nanjing Massacre, also known as the Rape of Nanjing. Over 6 weeks, invading troops mass murdered at least 200,000 people. Between 30 and 40,000 Chinese prisoners of war were executed, and it is estimated that between 20,000 and 80,000 women, including minors, were raped by the rampaging Japanese soldiers. They were frequently murdered after their sometimes by mutilation. Here we can see the testimony of a survivor of this massacre. Although the Kuomintang troops no longer offered resistance to the Japanese advance, there was a rural guerrilla, led by the Communist Party, that opposed the invaders through unconventional methods. One of the most important figures in this faction was the controversial Mao Zedong, who would become tremendously famous in the decades to come as the founder of the People's Republic of China and for his violent policies. The guerrilla strategies forced the Japanese command to change tactics, but also made them even more brutal against the innocent civilian population of China. A series of surprising Japanese defeats in 1939 led Chiang Kai-shek, the commander-in-chief of the Chinese forces, to launch his first major counteroffensive in early 1940. However, due to his poorly equipped, poorly trained, and disorganized troops, this attack was unsuccessful. Likewise, Japan had great difficulties in administering the conquered territories. Although it attempted to establish control through various puppet states, the atrocities committed by the invaders made these governments very unpopular. The final result was a stalemate on the Chinese front that would last 4 years, although the clashes continued throughout that time. Even though much less trained, Chinese troops managed to repel some Japanese attacks, showing the potential to be a powerful force if they could obtain better conditions. Let's now look at an example of these fierce Chinese defenses in what was the Battle of Changde in 1943. Here's when the United States entered the scene. But first, let's go back a few years. During the growing tension between Japan and China that culminated in the latter's invasion in 1937, Uncle Sam remained neutral. Although public opinion sympathized with the Chinese people for the brutalities they were enduring, they did not see vital interests in the country that justified going to war with Japan. This began to change after the start of the Second Sino-Japanese War. During the Nanking Massacre, the USS Panay was bombed by Japanese troops while evacuating American citizens. Thus, relations between the two countries, which were already not very friendly, were severely damaged. Starting in 1940, the United States, still not involved in World War II, began providing economic assistance to China while simultaneously imposing restrictions on its trade with Japan. the situation became even more complicated by the political treaties signed by the Japanese Empire, which first allied with Germany and Italy through the Tripartite Pact of 1940, and then established a neutrality pact with the Soviet Union in 1941. Additionally, it made an agreement with Vichy France for its troops to enter Indochina freely. All of this indicated that the Empire of the Rising Sun was considering attacking Southeast Asia, where the Allies and the United States had their colonies. This growing threat prompted the United States to cease negotiations with Japanese diplomats and impose a total embargo on exports to the island, depriving the Asians of their main supplier of steel, iron, and oil. This culminated in the well-known attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, and the declaration of war between the United States and Japan the following day. Immediately after this surprise attack, Japan seized many of the Allies' possessions in Southeast Asia. One of them was Burma, which was of particular interest because through this region, the Allies provided aid to China. The conquest of Burma by the Japanese Empire in May 1942 forced the Allies to send supplies through airplanes that now had to fly over the Himalayas, undertaking a much more difficult route. Despite these difficulties, the Allies established the China-Burma-India Theater of Operations, from which they would attempt to control the invader. In this theater, the first joint military actions between China and the United States took place. Although initially the American power did not provide troops, General Joseph Stilwell was placed in charge of the front, commanding Chinese and British divisions. The strategy that the United States pursued was to supply equipment and commanders to China to keep it in the war. In this way, hundreds of thousands of Japanese troops would be forced to battle on this front, leaving the path clear in other theaters of operations such as the Pacific. The operations on this front did not start off in the best manner. Despite the supplies sent by the Allies, the Chinese troops were less trained than the Japanese soldiers. Furthermore, the loyalty of many divisions to the leader of the Nationalist Party was questionable, as they were more loyal to their own commanders. To make matters worse, and despite Stilwell's complaints, the commander-in-chief Chiang Kai-shek decided to send many of his best divisions to block the forces of the Chinese Communist Party instead of using them against the invaders. This was because the truce between these two political forces, which came into effect with Japan's invasion, seemed about to break. Due to all these factors, the troops commanded by Stilwell could not confront the Japanese and were forced to retreat to India, much to the chagrin of the American who was already beginning to show his discontent with the Asian leader. There, the American general planned to train Chinese soldiers for the reconquest of Burma and subsequently China. Let's now watch a short video showing Chinese troops fighting in Burma.
One of the great days of this world war will be the day on which we and America can give all our attention to helping China against the Eastern gangsters. China was so pitifully unprepared for war, but like us, she made the best of it and she deserves the victory. And with every month that passes, China grows stronger. It seems that the nations who fight best in war are those most in love with peace.
The tensions between Stilwell and Chiang did not end there, which perhaps was a prelude to the future relationship between the two countries. The American military wanted to counterattack quickly and thus restore the supply line to China, while the Asian leader preferred his troops to be better equipped and trained before going on the offensive. Additionally, Chiang felt that Stilwell sought to gain total control of his soldiers, whom the Chinese leader guarded jealously. His plan was to wait until Japan was overwhelmed by the Allied forces and withdrew. Only then would Chinese troops stop losing tens of millions of soldiers, as had been happening up to that point. All of this influenced the United States to lose confidence in China's ability to fight on the Asian continent, so they prioritized their efforts in the Pacific Ocean areas, seeking to recapture territories taken by the Japanese, island by island. Finally, in early 1944, a counter-offensive was launched with the aim of regaining control of Burma. 2 Chinese divisions and an American brigade penetrated the tropical jungles of Southeast Asia, facing the entrenched Japanese troops. The objective of this unit, called Force X, was the construction of the Ledo Road, which would once again allow the shipment of equipment to China by land. With the support of British and colonial Allied reinforcements, they managed to penetrate to the north of the country. reaching the southern border of China and driving the Japanese out of those territories. Seeing their position in the Pacific deteriorating rapidly, Japan launched Operation Ichigo, which would be the largest offensive in the entire Second World War, mobilizing over 500,000 soldiers. This attack sought to seize the American air bases established in China, thus preventing the Allies from bombing the island of Japan. The operation was a success, as it broke the stalemate on the Chinese front, and the Japanese conquered many important cities and the Allied air bases. The failure of the Chinese defense sparked a heated discussion between commanders Joseph Stilwell and Chiang Kai-shek, which ended up breaking their fragile relationship, with the latter blaming him for moving too many Chinese troops to the Burmese front. Eventually, the American was replaced. At the end of 1944, Chinese troops, with logistical support from the Allies, launched simultaneous attacks from multiple fronts and managed to drive the already weakened Japanese army out of northern Burma. Thus, they re-established the main supply route to China. In the spring of 1945, the provinces of Hunan and Guangxi were wrested from the hands of the invaders. Here we can see the reconquest of the city of Changde, mentioned earlier.
The Chinese general in command of the forces which retook the city has reason to be pleased. He is able to present impressive quantities of captured Japanese equipment for inspection by Allied military observers.
There were Allied plans to continue reconquering Chinese cities, but the atomic bombs dropped on Japanese soil in August 1945, and the invasion of Manchuria by the Soviet Union hastened Japan's surrender. This led to the liberation of all Chinese territories conquered since their invasion. The Chinese population had hoped that their hardships would end with the conclusion of World War II, but they were severely disappointed. The country was economically weakened, with many of its rural areas destroyed by the war. Furthermore, the poor response to Operation Ichigo by Chiang's Nationalist Party had undermined its legitimacy, both politically and militarily. In contrast, Mao's communist forces saw their popularity increase with over 1 million members by 1945. Additionally, they were considered a military power to be feared. These were signs of the Civil War that would begin the following year. The relations between the United States and China, never openly friendly during World War II, worsened during the Civil War. When they realized that the Nationalist Party could not defeat the Communists, they decided to wait until the end of the war before recognizing the new government. General Marshall, sent to China as a mediator in the Civil War, declared in Congress that any large-scale effort by the United States to oppose the Communists would involve the commitment of considerable forces and resources for an indefinite period. This was how the Civil War culminated in 1949, with the Communist victory in China and the exile of the Nationalist Party to the island of Taiwan. The Americans refused to recognize Mao's so-called People's Republic of China, and only maintained diplomatic relations with the Republic of China, established in Taiwan. Since then, dealings between the two countries only grew colder, leaving far behind the past when they fought together against a common enemy. We've reached the end of the video, and we want to ask you, do you think that the relations between China and the United States could have been different if the Allies had adopted another strategy? Leave your answer in the comments section below, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel to learn about many more military events that left their mark on history.